I was 17 when Father Bell hired me to help clean St. Alden's Church during the summer. My parents were thrilled because it kept me out of trouble, and the church, built in the early 1900s, was one of those places that small towns cling to, as if history makes it holy. It stood at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by tall, iron-wrought fencing and whispering pines that always seemed to lean a little closer than they should. From the outside, it looked peaceful. From the inside, it felt like something was hiding beneath the floorboards. Father Bell was kind enough. He had that calm, measured voice that made you feel like everything he said came directly from God, and he always kept his hands folded tightly in front of him. He told me my job was to dust, sweep, polish the pews, and keep the sanctuary spotless for Sunday service. But the one rule he gave me, more than a rule, a command, was to never open the door behind the altar. The first time he said it, I nodded and tried to joke, asking if it was the wine cellar or the treasure room. He didn't laugh. He just stared at me longer than anyone should and said, "Some rooms in the house of God are locked for a reason." The door wasn't much to look at. It was wooden and narrow with an old brass handle that had long lost its shine. It had no keyhole, just a faint mark across the bottom where the wood was darker than the rest, as if something wet had been dragged underneath it again and again. I avoided it, at first out of respect, then out of unease. But after a few weeks, I started hearing things. Not all the time, only when I was cleaning late, alone in the building, with the windows dark and the wind barely audible through the stained glass. It started as faint tapping. Then it became shuffling, like footsteps on the other side of the door. Sometimes it was whispering. Not words exactly, more like the sound of someone praying in reverse. I told myself it was just the old bones of the church settling. But one afternoon, while polishing the brass candle holders near the altar, I heard a knock from behind the door. Clear, sharp, intentional. I froze. Then, without meaning to, I whispered, "Hello?" There was silence. Then, from the other side, a voice answered, "Please let me out." It wasn't Father Bell's voice. It was a girl, soft, young, and terrified. I stepped back, my heart racing, and asked who she was. There was no answer, just a muffled sob and another knock. I stood there for a long time, paralyzed, before I turned and left the church, locking it behind me. The next day, Father Bell wasn't angry. He was calm, maybe even more so than usual. He asked if I had been near the back room. I said no. He nodded, then handed me a worn Bible and asked me to read Psalm 91 aloud while I worked. He said it kept the building clean in more ways than one. After that, things got worse. During one stormy evening, the power flickered, and I saw the door behind the altar was slightly ajar, just enough to see darkness beyond it. Not the natural kind, but something deeper. I approached, unable to stop myself, like my body was being pulled by strings held in invisible hands. When I touched the handle, it felt warm, almost like skin. I leaned closer and saw scratches along the frame like fingernails had raked down the wood again and again. Then I heard breathing. Not my own, not human. I slammed the door shut and pushed one of the pews in front of it. The next morning it was wide open again. I finally confronted Father Bell. I told him I needed to know what was behind the door. He took a long breath and sat me down in the last pew, the one farthest from the light. He told me that long ago, before his time, a girl had gone missing from the orphanage the church once ran. She had been found days later inside that very room, her body torn apart, her face frozen in a smile. The police never solved it. The room was sealed, then sealed again after each strange event that followed. They tried exorcisms, prayer circles, even fire. Nothing worked. So they locked it. He said, "That voice you heard? That's not her." I asked what it was. He said, "It's what used to wear her face." After that, I quit. I couldn't go back. I thought I was done with that church, with its rot hidden under polished wood and sweet incense. But the door followed me. At night, in my own home, I hear knocking behind my closet door. I see scratches on my window frame. And sometimes when I wake up gasping, I swear I hear her whisper, "Please let me out." In a quiet, rural town nestled between pine woods and forgotten farmland, there's a story locals won't tell until after dark. They say it happened over 60 years ago, but no one remembers the pastor's real name now. They just call him Reverend Ash. Some say he was kind and gentle, a man who comforted the sick and buried the poor for free. Others claim he was strange even back then, often seen talking to himself in the graveyard behind the chapel, or standing alone inside the bell tower, whispering to things no one could see. What everyone agrees on is that one day, his entire congregation vanished. It was a cold Sunday morning when the townspeople filed into the little wooden church that stood at the edge of the forest. 43 men, women, and children walked in for service, and not one of them ever came back out. A few hours later, a traveler passing through stopped for gas and noticed the church doors wide open, the bell ringing on its own in the wind, and no sound coming from inside. When police arrived, they found the pews empty, the hymn books closed, and the altar untouched. The only soul in the building was Reverend Ash, standing in the pulpit with his Bible open and a smile frozen on his face. They questioned him, of course. He didn't resist. In fact, he welcomed the officers and offered them tea. When asked what had happened, he simply said, "They heard the true sermon. They went where they were called. There were no bodies, no blood, no footprints leading away from the church. Just silence, like the building had swallowed them whole." The Reverend was never convicted. He was sent to a state hospital, deemed unfit for trial. The church was boarded up, and over time, the story faded into whispered warnings and bonfire dares. But the locals still avoid the place. In recent years, strange things have started happening again. Teenagers who sneak into the church at night talk about hearing voices behind the pulpit. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language no one understands. Some say they see flickers of candlelight even though the building has no electricity, or catch glimpses of a tall figure in a black suit pacing between the pews. Others say that if you sit in the back row and close your eyes, you'll hear someone preaching softly just inches from your ear. One kid went missing after breaking in on a dare. His friends waited outside, but he never came out. When the sheriff searched the building the next morning, it was empty again, except for a single open Bible resting on the pulpit. The page was marked with a verse about sacrifice. His name had been carved into the wooden frame of the front pew, even though no one had touched it. People now believe Reverend Ash never left. They say the church isn't haunted by a ghost, but occupied by something that was always waiting to be invited in. The story goes that during his final sermon, the Reverend didn't speak to his congregation at all. He was preaching to something beneath the floor, something older than the town itself. Some say he struck a deal, offering the souls of his flock in exchange for immortality, not in body but in presence. And now, the church still hungers. There's one part of the legend that chills me more than the rest. They say that if you step inside the church after midnight and sit in the pastor's chair, you'll feel someone's hands resting gently on your shoulders. Then, no matter how fast you run, you won't remember how you got home. Days will go by, and eventually you'll find yourself standing in the woods behind the chapel, facing the back door, waiting to be let in. It's said that Reverend Ash doesn't take people all at once anymore. He waits. He selects, one by one. Last fall, someone reopened the building. They said they were restoring it for historical preservation, but the workers didn't stay long. One quit after claiming he heard someone breathing behind him every time he entered the sanctuary. Another said the bell rang every night at 3:03, even though the rope had been removed years ago. The final crew member fled after seeing what looked like 43 people sitting in the pews, silent, motionless, and staring at him. Now the doors are locked again, but sometimes when the wind shifts just right, you can hear faint music coming from inside. An old hymn, sung slowly and mournfully, as if someone is still holding Sunday service. Maybe Reverend Ash really did make a deal. Maybe he's still preaching, waiting for someone to answer his sermon. Maybe the church remembers those who walk through its doors. And maybe, once it has your name, it never lets go. I'm a freelance investigative journalist. Most of my work doesn't get read beyond conspiracy forums and message boards. But I chase real stories, the kind most outlets are too scared to touch. That's how I found myself in a dying town called Wexley, following a cold trail of missing persons that all led back to a small church named Mercy Hill. It started with a mother's email. Her son disappeared 6 months ago after joining a local church group. The police found no signs of foul play, and eventually they ruled it as a voluntary disappearance. But she wasn't buying it. She told me there were at least 5 others, young, healthy people with no reason to vanish, all connected by the same church. I started digging. Mercy Hill wasn't old, not like the usual Gothic relics you picture in horror stories. It was modern, clean, with LED screens and pastel walls and a young pastor who wore sneakers and told jokes during sermons. But something about it felt off. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. When I arrived in Wexley, I attended one of their Sunday services. The place was packed. Every face in the crowd wore the same expression, fixed, polite, a little too still. The pastor, Elijah Rourke, delivered a sermon about obedience, about how the body and spirit must be given fully to the will of the light. Not God, just the light. He never mentioned Jesus, never quoted the Bible directly, and yet no one blinked. No one questioned it. I introduced myself to Pastor Rourke afterward under a fake name and said I was writing a piece on local ministries. He smiled too wide and said, "You came at the right time. We're growing faster than ever." He invited me to stay for a small group meeting later that evening. I agreed, though every instinct told me to run. At the meeting, we sat in a dimly lit room behind the main sanctuary. 10 of us sitting in a circle while Rourke led a discussion about sacrifice. He asked each person what they were willing to give up for the light. One woman said her job. Another said her child. The others nodded in approval. No one laughed. No one hesitated. When it was my turn, I said I wasn't sure yet. Rourke stared into me like he was reading my thoughts and said, "The light already knows what you'll offer." Afterward, I tried to speak with some of the members privately. None of them would say a word unless Rourke was within earshot. One man grabbed my wrist and whispered, "They watch at night. Don't sleep on the second floor." Then he walked away before I could ask what he meant. That night, I booked a motel outside of town and started combing through missing persons reports. Every name the mother gave me had indeed vanished without a trace. The police interviews were vague. Several of the families mentioned Mercy Hill, but no one pressed further. Some of the missing had even left behind journals with strange, repetitive entries. Things like, "I am ready to enter the light," or "My flesh is not mine." The next morning, I went back to Mercy Hill, pretending I wanted to volunteer. They put me in their outreach center, a small building behind the church where donations were sorted and meals were handed out. But the basement was off limits. The door was locked with a keypad, and when I asked about it, I was told it was for staff only, and not to worry. But I had seen someone go down there with a box that looked far too heavy for just supplies. That night I broke back in. The church was empty. I waited until after midnight, then slipped through a side door I had wedged earlier. The hallway lights flickered and soft music played from somewhere above, like an old hymn slowed down to half speed. I made my way to the outreach building and pried the basement lock open with a crowbar. The stairs led down into something that didn't belong under a church. The floor was dirt. The walls were stone and metal, and the air smelled like damp wood and iron. There were no lights, just rows of candles and markings carved into the floor. Circles filled with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. And then I saw the room. It was windowless, lined with worn mattresses, chains bolted to the walls, and scraps of cloth that looked like torn uniforms or personal clothing. In the center of the room was a long table stained dark, and on the far wall a mural, a painting of a burning figure surrounded by kneeling people with their eyes gouged out. Beneath it, the words, "The light demands everything," were written in something that looked like blood. Before I could run, I heard footsteps behind me. Pastor Rourke stood in the doorway. He wasn't smiling this time. He said, "You came to see. Most don't get this far. That means the light wants you too." I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it out, but I remember crashing through brush and mud. The sound of voices rising behind me, chanting louder with every step I took. I made it back to my car and drove until the sun came up. I tried contacting the sheriff's office, but the report vanished. When I called the local station days later, the person who answered said there was no record of anyone by my name ever visiting Wexley. A few weeks later, I received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a photo of me standing inside the outreach building holding a candle, with others kneeling around me, faces blurred, but mine perfectly clear. I have no memory of it. Now I keep moving. I never stay in one place for long, but some nights I wake up with the sound of chanting in my ears, and once I found a note taped to my motel door. It said, "You have seen the light. Why keep running from it? If you're reading this and you've heard of Mercy Hill, stay away. They're still out there, and they're still growing."